When I hear the word sustainability, for years, I always believed that they were talking about financial sustainability, which indeed they are. But the most important part of sustainability, because the programs that I have seen that, this is a general statement. I have seen some programs that didn't make it, not because they didn't necessarily have the money, but they lost their vision. And so their vision or their purpose became not sustainable. And I've seen organizations in an effort to just keep bringing in money, chase the dollar and go after funding that isn't really consistent with their vision and mission. So I plead with anybody to do this, to never lose your purpose or your vision, and that the funding you get should always support that in whatever way that it can. And that to me is the most important part of sustainability. That being said, because we had this nonprofit who helps nonprofits, we had a great model for a business plan. And that's one of the areas that I wasn't necessarily well trained in. And so to have an organization who could help us like that, and I suggest trying to find someone who knows how to write a really nice looking business plan. They care about what it looks like. I don't know why that is, but they do. And the other thing is having not just one funding stream, but sustainability, having multiple ways of funding it, so that with an understanding what percentage of the funding that funding stream is, and what part of it is, and how, once you accept that funding, it impacts on your long-term vision and purpose. So some organizations have gone the Medicaid route, but really understand how having a Medicaid reimbursement impacts on the language that people use, which we already talked about that today, how important the language that we use is in helping people and supporting people, how important that language is. So certain funding streams are going to give you different language and understanding how to translate it. So I always recommend multiple funding streams. I can tell you the funding streams we had in Alaska, which was, we got a pretty large state grant. How we did that, it took us 3 years of educating people in the legislature. We met with all kinds of legislators, and we were meeting with this one senator, and I never expected he would hop on board. I didn't think it was his bailiwick. And I could barely finish talking, because you only get 10 to 15 minutes if you're on a good day with a legislator. And I said, stop, I got it. He said, I understand this. He said, I'm going to carry this bill for you. And I couldn't believe it. And I said, you are? And he said, my neighbor down the road, and this is a guy who's a doctor as well as a legislator, a reindeer farmer. And he said, I have a neighbor down the road, and they have a family member who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, has been way over medicated, has no personality left. It's a terrible thing. I'm carrying this for you. And he did. And we got a huge state funding from that. But, with the state funding comes other things that have to be done. So we had to have matching funds, 25% matching funds. And the state was heavily trying to rely on a Medicaid fundable system. So we had to dip into the Medicaid pool, even though we were extremely ambivalent about it. But that was a very small percentage of our budget. It was like 7%. And then we had other funding, but those are the two big ones. We had visions of becoming a training center, and we thought we might be able to access DVR funds, voc rehab, state vocational rehabilitation funds. We were never able to do that. So things change along the way. But if you can put on paper your best projection and be understanding, you have to review it and change it. So that's my thoughts on sustainability.